Hi, welcome to a video about primary keys. And this video will of course talk about primary keys as it relates to Access. So in this video we want to talk about what is a primary key, setting a primary key in Access, whether it's one field or multiple fields, different approaches to determining what the primary key should be. For example, you might use a field that has a data type of auto number, or you might have a different approach, and we can talk about that. And then, of course, we can talk about which is best in different situations. From there, we'll talk about properties of primary keys, specifically that you cannot have a blank field that is part of a primary key, and you will get an error in Access. And then finally, we'll talk about the fact that since primary keys are used to be unique identifiers, they can't have duplicate values, because that would be the opposite of unique, right? Duplicate is the opposite of unique. So, okay. And then, of course, we'll summarize at the end. So let's talk about what primary keys are. And to do that, let's first talk about some situations in your life that you've used for being unique identifiers. For example, your Social Security number. When you call the IRS, they ask for your Social Security number so that they can look up your data. They use that number as a unique identifier of you. Then there's also the S number. Your S number they use at the college to identify your particular data. It's a unique identifier. If you go into the bank, they'll ask you what your account number is so that they can look up all sorts of different information about your account. And then finally, another unique identifier would be your fingerprint. So there's lots of different kinds of identifiers out in the world that you've been introduced to that you just don't think about. So a primary key in Access or in databases is something that's used to identify a particular record. So it can be one particular field, like for example, an S number, a Social Security number. And so you could have a record that has S number and identified as a primary key, and then it would have other information associated with that particular identifier. So we've been talking for the last few minutes in conceptual terms. Here I want to give you a more concrete demonstration of what I mean by a primary key / identifier. So here, for each one of these particular records, we have an identifier, what is called ID. This field is called ID, and it is used as the primary key or the identifying field for each particular record. What I mean by that is that, for example, this particular identifier as 000010 identifies this particular record. So let's look at Access as it relates to primary keys and the actual mechanics of setting a primary key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the design view of this particular table. And I have the design view of this table showing. And here are a list of all of the fields that make the structure of this particular table. And I want to set this field right here to be the primary key. So I'm going to click in the box just to the left of the primary key. And then I'll go ahead and right click on it. And then I'll click on primary key. And that sets the primary key for this particular table. Now, one thing you should notice is that I set the primary key for this table to have only one field be the primary key. And so you can have more than one field be the primary key. And I will show you how to do that in Access in a moment. So we're back to the screen being blank for any tables showing. And I have a number of tables over here that I could have at my disposal. And so I'm going to use this particular table to demonstrate how you set the primary key for when you want to have more than one field consist together to make up the primary key. So to do that, I'm going to right click on this particular table and I'm going to go into the design view. And here I am in design view of this table, and I want to have 3 fields. This one, exercise date, this one, exercise begin time, and then exercise description. I want all 3 of those fields to make up the primary key. And in order to do that in Access, I'm going to first come here and I'm going to click next to the first field that I want to have as my primary key. And then I'm going to press the Shift key down and I'm going to click to the left of the other 2. And so now you can see that all 3 of those fields are in fact selected. So now I'm going to continue to hold the Shift key down, and on the last field of the list of all of the fields that I want as my primary key, I'm going to right click and then I'm going to click on primary key. And so now the primary key is set. And the primary key is consisting of 3 different fields: exercise date, exercise begin time, and exercise description. So I'm now in the datasheet view of that particular table, and I want to demonstrate what it is to have a unique record with all 3 fields. So let's go ahead and first look at this particular record, 7/31/2016, 12:30 p.m., hiked 4 miles. Alright, so if I go down here and I say 7/31/2016, and I come here to 12:30 p.m. and I say hiked 4 miles, just as it says up above, and then I go to enter a new record, it gives me an error that says that the changes were unsuccessful because I have duplicate data entered. Okay? If I wanted to have the record be saved, you would have to change one of these particular fields at least. So I could, for example, change the date on this record. Now this all three of these would not be the same as this one. This particular field is different than this one. So the combination of all three of these is not the same as the one above. So when I go to enter a new record, it does not give me an error. The same is true. Let me go back. And if I put the 1 here, and let's say that I change this to 1245, and then I go to type in a new record, again, these three fields are not the same as the ones above it. So the combination of these three fields are not duplicated anywhere else in the table, and thus it does not give you an error. However, if the combination of the data that's entered is the same as another record, it will give you an error and it will not allow you to enter that information. So now let's go back to our PowerPoint slide presentation and let's talk about determining a primary key. That's pretty tricky sometimes, and it takes some thought. Now your book, it uses fields that, single fields that have an auto number as the data type. And in some cases, that's appropriate. There are other times where you might use a different field that doesn't have an auto number as the data type, and that would be more appropriate. And then in other cases, more than one field put together, also known as a composite key, would be the best for that particular situation. And so you really have to understand and think about your particular situation and then judge what is best for that situation. So let's talk a little bit about different situations that would warrant one choice over another. So I've switched here to a database that has a table in it that has a list of just supplements and medications. And it doesn't have any particular identifiers associated with them that is known to the developer, namely me. I just have a list here, and so if I'll go and I'll show you what I mean. Here is just a list of different supplements that I take, and so I've got them right here. And I don't particularly know of any identifiers. So in that case, I'm going to go back over here to the design view. And I'll show you what I mean. Here I have an ID field, and I just gave it auto number for the identifier for that particular record. So that I do have a primary key set, but it's just an auto number field, because I don't have any other kind of way of identifying each record. So that's why I made the decision to use auto number and ID as the identifying field for each record in this table. So let's talk about a different way of identifying the primary key. You might have a field that doesn't have an auto number data type. Why would you do that? Well, let's say you have a situation like this one where you have a list of books. Well, what's an identifier for a book? It would be the ISBN number. So in this case, we made the ISBN number be the primary key. And you could think about other situations too, like for example an S number. Instead of using an auto number field, you would use S number, and then the S number would be typed in, but it would be unique. There's also the situation, like you saw earlier, where we would have combinations of fields that would make up the primary key. And the one thing that I want to say is that databases do sometimes use auto number fields for their primary key when they could be using things like ISBN or a combination of fields to make the primary key. And what I would say is that the disadvantage of using an auto number is that it could catch occurrences of the user entering information twice. And a table that has a primary key with an auto number data type, it just allows you to keep on entering records. It doesn't catch when you entered data multiple times, because if you had a combination of fields and you had entered them duplicate times, then you would know, oh, I've already entered this information. But with auto number field, it never catches that. And that's the disadvantage of using the auto number as a primary key. The final point that I want to make are there's some characteristics of primary key fields that I want you to be aware of. One is that when you're typing in a record, if you leave the primary key blank, it will give you Access will give you an error. And then, like I showed earlier, it will not allow you to have duplicate values. So in summary, a primary key is a unique identifier of a record. To set the primary key in Access for a table, you need to go into the design view of that particular table and then click on the particular squares that are to the left of those fields, holding the Shift key down, right-clicking, and then clicking on primary key. There are different approaches to determining the primary key. You can use a field that has auto number, or you can use other fields, either one or more fields in combination, to determine the primary key. And the reason that you would use one over the other depends on the situation that is for your particular database. And then finally, the characteristics of a primary key. You cannot have blank values in any field that is declared as a primary key, and you cannot have duplicate of a primary key. And so that summarizes primary keys. Thanks.